We are back here on Post Wrestling, joined by the man we always want to discuss the quarterly reports with. He is always welcome here, but 4 times a year, a must-have here at postwrestling.com. From Wrestlenomics, he is Brandon Thurston, who is a very extremely busy individual, but he has carved out some time for us here at Post Wrestling. Brandon, how are you today?
I'm good. The Wrestlenomics headquarters is in the middle of their move. I can't believe that we planned it at the same time that WWE is doing their Q2 report as they were yesterday. But it was an interesting report. I think you were following it as it was happening, right?
Yes, I was following it in real time. Number one, I applaud Wrestlenomics and their aggressiveness to go forward with relocating their headquarters as opposed to postponing it to post-COVID. But off the top, now that we've had 2 of these, how do you feel about the Thursday evening drop of the report and then the earnings call at 5 p.m. Eastern? I'm really struggling with this new time.
It's I don't know. The documents used to drop at 9 a.m. Mm-hmm. When I brought this up, I was told that this is actually totally normal for most companies that are publicly traded, that they do it after the market closes, and it was weird. I think W was one of few companies that did it in the middle of the day while the market was still trading. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. I'm okay with it. I'm all right with just going into the evening and looking at this stuff rather than having to do it during the day.
What is your headline takeaway from this report, and how surprised were you? Because I know you did a real extensive study looking at the realities of WWE's finances, even if they run no more live events the rest of this year. So I can't imagine you were shocked, but maybe by just the volume of how profitable they ended up being this quarter.
Yeah, W really exceeded the profits that the analysts expected. The analysts are the people that you hear on the conference call asking questions, but it's pretty easy for me to predict revenue, and everybody, myself and whatever predictions the analysts were making, we were pretty close on that. At least what's harder for me is figuring out profit, because that involves, at least in the case of like net income, knowing stuff about taxes, and I get kind of lost in the calculation. Maybe I'll learn it as time goes on. But I guess I predicted when I did the article a few months ago back in May, sort of unraveling how WWE would, even if it ran no events, would still have its most profitable year ever. I found that the operating income would be something like $70 million, and I found that net income for this quarter would be, I think, 48, and it was, or maybe I predicted like 49 or something like that. It ended up being 48. Anyway, I was pretty close, but I think that's sort of just a blind squirrel, finding a nut there. But I think that generally, I do think I'm generally accurate, and I was, generally on the money about this is going to be WWE's most profitable year ever, and the results of today, or the results of yesterday, just affirmed that WWE's got about 70, just in the first half, the first 6 months of this year so far, has got $70 million in net income. The all-time record was 2018, when they did $99.6 million. So it seems like a foregone conclusion to me that they're going to break their all-time record, even when you adjust for inflation going way back to the late 90s and early 2000s. They're going to set their all-time record for profits for the history of the company. And again, I don't know if the analysts maybe didn't understand the degree to which WWE is saving money in the performance center, rather than dealing with the expenses of broadcasting live from an arena. I'm guessing that made for the difference in what analysts expected and what WWE reported. Aftermarket trading for WWE went up about $3 after the closing bell. So the difference with Q1 is that there were only a few weeks in Q1 where W was dealing with this empty arena situation. So there was only a couple weeks out of 3 months in Q1 for analysts to get an idea of what the financial impact was going to be, or in this case, the financial benefit. But this was obviously an entire quarter. April, May, and June is Q2, and this was an entire quarter here where we've been in this pandemic era.
So numbers for the quarter, they made net income of $43.8 million off revenue of $223.4 million. So, comparing to last year, I mean, obviously profit through the roof in comparison, revenue down. But I think that's the major takeaway, is looking at how much they're saving doing this very a truncated version of producing television. They spent significantly less, savings of over $51 million when it came to expenses for television and various production throughout this. And that kind of opens up the question, Brandon, like there's no right or wrong answer, but just looking at the long-term future, if the WWE is taking certain lessons from this period of how we produce television, costs that are necessary versus costs that are just somewhat unnecessary when it comes to what we can save to produce our television at a level that we're meeting the demands of our contracts, and how much is spending that we need to necessarily reintroduce once fans are back and things are more normal than they are during this current period.
Yeah, it almost suggests that, W should just find a single central location, maybe a theme park or something, to run their weekly TV out of, or run a lot of their weeks of TV out of. But I think at a minimum, they need to do shows in front of fans. A lot of conversation on the call in the Q&A was asking about ratings and why ratings for Raw and SmackDown have declined. And Vince's best answer was that, it's because of the live audience isn't there, and that's why we're hurting in ratings. And they obviously do need to go back to a situation where they have a large audience there that's reacting strongly. So while they're benefiting from this at the moment with way lower expenses by not broadcasting live and not broadcasting out of arenas, I think in the long term they need to get back to arenas. And Vince kind of made it sort of hinted that they would figure out a way to get audiences back maybe sooner than people were expecting. And it sort of reminds me of something that Stephanie McMahon said in that interview that she did with Ad Age that you turned me on to, that she sort of hinted at some point in that interview that, I think I just want to put it out there that we might be doing, shows with audiences one way or another, sooner than people expect. So I don't know what they've got in mind, and maybe they're thinking about doing something outdoors, or I had somebody on Twitter suggested to me that maybe they're going to go to Fight Island. maybe they're going to make a deal with Dana and they're going to go to Fight Island. I don't know. I've heard NBA is doing some interesting things, and Fox is talking about doing some interesting things with, incorporating virtual fans or something. But, or I don't know if just the McMahons think that COVID is going to be a less of a problem sooner than I think it's going to be. I think we're going to not be in a situation in the United States for many months, if not for the rest of the year and beyond, where we're going to be able to run events at sporting arenas again. I don't think that's going to happen until there's a vaccine, and maybe not after that. So yeah, I just thought that was odd that he thinks that he's going to be able to bring audiences back. And I think he was feeling some pressure on the call from the analysts about ratings. I think, like, most notably, there was a question from Brandon Ross of Lightshed, who had just written a blog a couple days prior to the earnings report. Really, I think letting Vince have it about creative and not producing stars, and not basically speculating that maybe at the current level of viewership, the way the viewership is going now, that maybe WWE is going to have a challenge continuing to grow its TV rights fees. And I don't know about that, but he did ask a number of questions, including, is Paul Levesque going to be why isn't Paul Levesque in an elevated role on the main roster, essentially? Why do you think Raw and SmackDown haven't recovered from COVID in the viewership the way that NXT and AEW have? And I think the obvious difference between NXT and AEW compared to Raw and SmackDown is Raw and SmackDown are two programs that are controlled by Vince McMahon, and NXT and AEW, certainly AEW is not controlled at all by Vince McMahon, but NXT is largely, delegated to Paul Levesque. And I think that's sort of the distinction that should be made. And I think a lot of the analysts, they study WWE business among a lot of other businesses, and, they're very well trained in how to, analyze the finances of a company. But I don't think a lot of the analysts are paying attention to the content. And I think if you would pay attention to the content, it raises some concerns in the more long term about, the consumer metrics have been down year over year for a few years, and just raises some questions about, how popular WWE is going to be able to stay for the duration of its TV contracts, and whether that's going to raise any problems for WWE when they have to start talking about renewals of their TV contracts in a couple of years. these contracts will go until September 2024. Mm-hmm. So they're going to be, through that time, they're going to be increasingly profitable. Next year is going to be even more profitable than this year.
Yeah. And I think that is kind of the purgatory that like analysts are looking at this company in. Like this is a incredibly financially lucrative period for this company, but it also comes across that you take out television rights, it paints a very different picture. And those TV deals aren't going away overnight, but you have to look at these trends. Is it going to be something in 4 years from now where, yes, popularity has declined, but still in comparison, networks see value in WWE? Or is it going to be something where these deals that they struck, that went into effect last year are going to be off the table, and that significantly alters the state of this company? So I think that a lot of analysts, they don't want to be the sky is falling, but at the same time, like the ratings were clearly a big issue this quarter for analysts, whereas prior months, I think they were much more open to the reasoning that Vince McMahon would give. And I saw a lot more pushback this time around.
Yeah. I think there's been a lot of discussion about what matters when it comes to viewership. And that's been something I've been trying to talk with people about and understand. The key demo is the most important number, though, right? But I think people have asked me at what point does USA Network or does Fox really start to get concerned? And I don't think they're at that point now. I think maybe the metrics that we need to focus on more than maybe most people do is the rankings, sort of where does Raw rank in the USA Network among all of its programs. The press release that they put out yesterday says that Raw is number 1 and NXT is number 3 on the USA Network. I think we need to look at where the programs rank on their night. Raw gets reported into 3 hours, and usually those 3 hours are within the top 5 or so. Maybe there's 1 hour out of the top 5 that's like number 7 or something like that. So usually all 3 hours are within the top 10. In the key demo, by the way, SmackDown on Friday has been usually the number 1 show in the key demo, although it's usually well behind on total viewership, but still doing really well in the key demo. And NXT is well behind AEW. I think they usually end up somewhere in the 20s or the 30s. They have been staying in the top 50 lately, though. But I think that's a thing to focus on. If you look at the long view picture of Raw viewership, especially because Raw hasn't had the benefit like SmackDown has had of jumping around to different networks. But if you look at the long picture of Raw viewership, you can see it going back to 2015 to the present, that Raw's viewership has fallen in half. And while it has, it's still over that time remained a highly ranked program. And I think that's a major factor in that it's not necessarily about the decline, but where in the hierarchy a program like WWE Raw, lies for the USA Network. It's still a peak program in a media environment where there's less and less peak programming, and that the peak programming that is still around becomes increasingly valuable. One of the things that I think that was being speculated about in the Lightshed article about WWE stock was that, maybe we're, going towards a future where that will be even more exacerbated. So not just will live content be extra valued, but the most popular live content will be valued, and maybe at the expense of the less popular live content. So in other words, maybe there's a future where NBCU and Fox don't want to bid highly for WWE because they're saving that money up for bigger sports like the NFL. So, that's just one possibility, maybe a few years from now. But I still see no reason to doubt that WWE is going to, at least at its current level of popularity, be able to continue to get, really good TV rights fees, maybe at least at the level that they're at now. But I think the narrative that I've been thinking about a lot, and I think is true over the last few months where we've been in this COVID era, that COVID has sped up a lot of consumer trends. So maybe, Raw is doing only like 1.5 million viewers now for some of the hours. And maybe that would have taken a year or two. Maybe it would have taken a year or two to get there in a non-COVID, timeline. But in this timeline, people's routines have been disrupted. Not to mention that the wrestling programming is really weird because there's no audience there. So I think there's in Raw and SmackDown's case, especially compared to AEW and NXT, who are all dealing with this no crowd thing. But in case of Raw and SmackDown, I think a lot of the attachments between those programs and their fans were looser than the attachments with the smaller audiences of NXT and AEW, which have stuck around more strongly. But the people who are maybe watching Raw and SmackDown, have checked out of it at a higher rate. And compounding on that, I think COVID has disrupted people's life routines. At least for a few months here in the U.S., people were not going to work. But I think it's sped up a lot of trends.
How do you assess the WWE's navigation of reaching a younger audience? Like, certainly that's been a major discussion point about, the aging audience that the WWE has. And yet here is a company that is very diverse when it comes to their social media trends, being one of the top YouTube channels that's out there. And, a point you brought up, being on different platforms that are going to reach audiences that maybe are not watching television. How equipped do you feel WWE is right now with its programming that is creating newer fans, or at least reaching younger fans?
I guess, compared to most television, they do better than most. So say, Fox, for example, their audience is way younger than anything on Friday night in prime time that they're up against. And Raw does pretty well relative to other programming in terms of having a younger audience. Now, that being said, I think the creative direction of both of those programs doesn't make those programs very cool programs. And I'm sure, people are following it in alternate ways. I think there's a lot of people who, engage with WWE to some extent. They have they're sort of paying attention to it, but they're certainly not going to sit down on the couch and turn on linear TV and watch a 3-hour Raw, especially when the content has, when people have the expectation about what the content is and they don't see it as maybe as entertaining. I'm sure there definitely are people, who interact with me and probably you who love WWE and love it the way it is. But I think there's, just the nature of what they haven't built any stars. There's not a lot of continuity. There's a lot of, the programming feels repetitive, a lot of rematches and stuff. I just think there's it's not a cool show. NXT is a little bit cooler, and AEW is a little bit cooler. So I think these programs do a better job of, well, as soon as I say that though, NXT has got the oldest median viewer, doesn't it? But yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about just, if you create stars, that's how you, especially if they're new, younger stars, that's how you attract new audiences and probably young audiences as well.
We knew that, the television revenue, the fact that throughout the whole pandemic that they could run all of these shows, they're making this enormous savings and they're taking in all of their television money. That was going to carry them this year. But we also saw some other profit sectors within this quarter. Consumer products. That was somewhat surprising to me, the fact that they saw such a growth in that area during the pandemic, that we're not running live events, but that was, that's an area that you would just think off the top of your head, yeah, that's probably going to suffer during this time. During a pandemic, it was the complete opposite.
Yes. So W has 3 major divisions, and one of them is consumer products. Within consumer products, there's 3 segments that they report on, and that's product licensing, which is their licensed products that they don't make themselves, but so things like video games and mobile games and action figures. But then there's venue merchandise sold at the venue, and merchandise that they sell online. And obviously there's no venue merchandise in Q2 because there were no events. So that segment was literally at zero. And I had thought about this, what's e-commerce? That's what they call their online merchandise segment. What's e-commerce going to be like, in this quarter? And I kind of predicted that it would be down slightly quarter over quarter, especially when you consider, maybe, the economy is really taking a huge hit right now. Maybe consumers, they don't have as much money to spend. But actually the segment was, I think it's $12.6 million in revenue, which is up from usually that segment does something between like 6 and 9 in a quarter like Q2.
6.6 last year. Yeah. Up to 12.6. Yeah. So like they doubled.
Right. So I guess, maybe consumers are compensating for not, I don't know. That's just, I can't figure out a story to tell myself other than it does seem like consumers are compensating. I guess I don't feel like, well, I was going to buy X, Y, and Z merchandise at the show I was going to go to, but I didn't go. Or maybe there were just stronger promotions around WrestleMania time. I would expect to see it a little bit lower. I imagine WrestleMania had something to do with it.
So those replica belts, Brandon, people are stuck in their homes and they can wear those things every day now. You don't have to have the embarrassment of going outside wearing your replica belt. You can just wear it around your house. I mean, this is the golden era of replica belt sales, perhaps.
And did you know there are financing options for your replica belts so that if you
I saw you tweet that there are options to basically put this on like layaway if you want to invest in a championship belt right now, which I am not an analyst, but I'm going to be everyone's financial advisor here. If you can't afford a replica belt right now, don't buy a replica belt right now.
Good God. Yeah, if you can't afford, I don't really, what do they go for, like 3 or 5? I know the Bray thing was like $5,000 or something, but yeah, if you don't have a couple $100 to pay for a replica belt, maybe you need to reevaluate your financial decisions rather than buying a belt. But yeah, consumer products where online merchandise was way up. I'm curious to see how it will be next quarter. I think it'll be down a little bit, but it does seem like people are compensating somewhat for not being at venues. One other thing we should bring up here is that the stock buyback program. Did you catch that?
Yeah. So this was a $500 million program that they were ready to introduce. And then when the pandemic hit, they were pulling this. And then, they kind of have given the impression that they're going to be bringing it back, although not flat out stating it was. But it looks like they're open to reintroducing that program.
Yeah, so it was something that they were doing before COVID, which is like a stock buyback program, as far as I understand. Is something that a company does to buy back its own shares, which increases the demand for the shares, which increases the value of the shares. So that's good for investors. It's good for everybody that holds the stock. It's something that spends the company's cash, though. So that's why they stopped it when COVID started to affect them, so that they would have more cash to, have cash on hand in case their business wasn't doing well. But now they said, yesterday that they're considering options they're trying to analyze, well, when is our share price, in our opinion, undervalued? And when we think it's undervalued, we'll buy some stock. But the point is, for anybody who thought that, this company was going to be, in bad shape or at risk of not being profitable because of COVID. And, there's a lot of arguments around the time of April 15th when a lot of people were cut and a lot of employees were furloughed and there's even quotes from Paul Levesque about how, it's a difficult time. A lot of businesses are making difficult decisions right now. And, you just got to do it, I guess. But this company is so comfortable financially with the way that they are, even despite the pandemic, that they're considering using some of the cash that they have on hand to buy back their own stock, which is not something that a company that's, in risk of losing money does. So, and I just think that, if you're, and we all know that the talent who were laid off, we know their names and faces, but I think it's really, if I were a WWE employee who lost, their job because of this cost cutting, I would be pretty upset to hear that the company is going to use some of the money that it's saving to possibly buy back its own stock.
Yeah, and that's something like I never expect those kinds of subjects to be brought up in these calls because I really don't feel that
it's good for investors.
Exactly. And it's like I feel very much it sounds callous, but it's the performers are just, numbers on a page that are performing the work. And it's those kinds of issues like ethical questions do not come up on these shareholders calls. And maybe it's not even the forum for it, but I think that certainly people, like you or I, that's certainly a subject that I look at as well in all of this is that in this quarter, they didn't even enjoy the savings of all those cuts because the main roster cuts at least were still on their 90-day no compete. So there's further savings to come in the next quarter.
Right. Yeah. I mean, as far as like ethical questions, like one of the things that I found frustrating at first and not really understanding what was going on is that when I started listening to this stuff too, there was a lot of excitement around the WWE Network. And I think analysts were especially optimistic and rosy, but, it felt too much like, they were part of the team rather than, and I expected, this sounds like a press conference to me. So I want people to ask the tough questions. but that's really not what this is, right? It's analysts. And I think I see people sometimes just thinking that these are callers or maybe these are shareholders, but these are analysts whose job it is to understand the company and basically predict what their finances are going to be. So, but I think there have been a couple times questions, especially around Saudi Arabia, about Mike Hickey, who's one of the analysts, once asked, how do you reconcile, you've got this women's evolution and you're really pro women. How you reconcile that with going to Saudi Arabia, where obviously they treat women very differently, more restrictively. So there are questions like that sometimes, and they had to do that one conference call the few days before they went and did Crown Jewel around the time of Jamal Khashoggi's killing, and there were a couple uncomfortable questions being asked there, but generally yes, I think it's not their job to get the truth and get to the bottom of the real story. It's their job to understand the company and to make accurate estimates of what the financial picture is going to be.
Yeah, I was curious going into this. It wasn't a question I necessarily assumed would come, but given all the problems Major League Baseball is going through at the moment by diverting from the bubble system that the NBA has incorporated, that the NHL has gone through. And when you look at WWE, I mean, they're running a smaller scale version of what Major League Baseball is doing. It's not apples to apples, but you're flying in your performers from all over the place. It's not like they're quarantining once they get to Florida and they're in any kind of a bubble. And there was an outbreak that was not covered at all on this. It's more so WWE now has their policy in place where they can say we're doing proper COVID testing, we're wearing masks, we're socially distancing. But that was not the case a month and a half ago.
Right. Yeah. I wrote a list of questions that I suggested, here's some questions that analysts could ask, not expecting that they would. And of course, a lot of them didn't get asked, but I would like to ask, how many wrestlers or how many people, because it's probably not just wrestlers, but it's crew as well, probably, that were released at risk. How many people have tested positive for COVID? I think Stephanie sort of made it sound in that Ad Age interview a week or two ago that, we're doing testing, sort of just making it sound as if they had always been doing testing, when actually they were the last to test among, for example, they were the last to test among AEW and UFC, and they only did it after there was a significant outbreak. So, but again, what financial bearing does that have on the company? I've been arguing before they even started testing that they're really putting their talent at risk, which is really valuable to the company. You can say from, not even considering a moral argument, that you're putting your talent at risk. And if your talent's at risk, they can't be on TV. And if they can't be on TV, they can't contribute to your show, and your TV rights are your biggest source of revenue. So you're putting that at risk, but at least they're doing testing now, and but generally the investors, I don't think have been hurt by this. If anything, you've seen Roman Reigns just decide to sit it out. He's the biggest full-time star, I guess, that they have at this point, but he's decided to sit out, sort of preemptively for all this.
Moving on to the WWE Network, they reported total paid subscribers of just under 1.7 million as of June 30th. And this is the area of the business that I would say we could see the biggest philosophical shift in the wake of Michelle Wilson and George Barrios leaving the company, because in the shareholders conference that took place in mid-July, they kind of just snuck it in there, the fact that the tiered system is been shelved at this point. They've dropped the 30-day free trial and introduced the free tier. And I guess based on these results thus far, that has been a winning strategy based on the early returns that we've seen.
Yeah, so that started on June 1st, the free tier. So, and that was talked a little bit on the annual shareholders call on July 16th. And we've seen the emergence of this J.R. Donlin, who's the executive vice president of Advanced Media Group, which is a strange subtitle. I don't know what that means, Advanced Media Group. But anyway, he seems to be very involved in the network, or at least this free tier. And I don't know, they're generally optimistic about how the free tier is going. They say they've only been doing it for now, this is 2 months. But they say they're seeing some conversion there. I guess the idea is that you use the free tier to first of all, convert people to being paid subscribers, doing away with the trial that way too. But you want to convert people into being paid subscribers, but then also you can get some ad revenue out of these people by, putting ads on this thing. So I guess that's what they're trying to do there. There was some talk on the call about what the value still is of selling the network or the network content, or more specifically, probably the pay-per-views to a major streaming player, maybe ESPN Plus, maybe Peacock. There's some talk about Amazon Prime even. There's some talk about whether it seems pretty imminent when they did their call in February before the pandemic really started to hit. It seems pretty eminent that they were going to sell to maybe ESPN Plus or maybe NBCU, the pay-per-views off of the network. Vince made it sound like you might even see it before, Q1 was over, which would have been March 31st. Obviously that never happened, and COVID really started to take effect in the middle of March. And, they've said publicly that, the negotiations continue, which I don't know. I take to mean the negotiations have paused, at least for now, as the streaming players maybe don't want to commit a lot of guaranteed money, don't want to get themselves on a contract with WWE when maybe WWE's business is uncertain and when maybe money is tight for any of these companies as well. But there was a question about whether WWE thinks that the value for the network content on a major streaming player is as high as it was when they were thinking about it earlier. And I know interim CFO Frank Riddick just sort of said that he thinks that there's going to be winners and losers in the streaming market. And I took what he was saying to mean that there's a lot of competition among streaming players. And I think maybe NBCU's Peacock is really going to need a lot of things to try to set itself apart. And, they had originally planned on putting a lot of content from the Olympics on Peacock, which just launched fully this month in July. And there's obviously the Olympics are not happening this summer. So I think they're in a position to really need something special, like maybe WWE content to attract subscribers. So I don't know. I think that'll happen. I think maybe the best option for WWE in a scenario where they don't have pay-per-views on the network, I think there's still a market for the network to have a few, maybe 100,000 subscribers who will continue to subscribe to the network for $10 a month, if only for the library content and maybe the takeovers stay on the network. I think there will be a ton of upheaval and a ton of cancellations, of course, but I think there's probably still a very profitable way to keep the network going and to keep a lot of subscribers who will find it still a bargain to have the library and maybe to have other content like the takeovers and maybe 205 Live and whatever else they've got on there.
Just when you look at the professional wrestling audience as a whole, like such a big asset is the fact that you have an audience that is trained for once a month, that they pay for the big event. And when we've seen how much success UFC has had during the pandemic on ESPN Plus, it makes you wonder, like, is WWE content more valued at this point? That I'm sure an ESPN Plus or a competitor would love to have, a destination program that you have an audience base that is willing to pay for a product once a month.
Yeah, I think the waters have really been muddied. I know I did a podcast a few months ago talking about how I think maybe pay-per-view is the best way to monetize peak events. AEW's had some success in that regard. At the same time, WWE Network has taught people that a peak event is really worth no more than $10. Now, on the other hand, AEW and others have sold pay-per-views for $50, and AEW seems to be doing roughly 100,000 buys for every show that they do. I guess in particular, obviously the problem in WWE's case is trying to transition people out of the habit of, just paying for pay-per-views as part of a bundle, at $10 a month, where they get a pay-per-view along with a ton of other stuff on demand. And how much customer upheaval is there going to be if they, for example, put the pay-per-views onto ESPN Plus and ask people to pay $50 or $60 or more for them? Mm-hmm. And I think I think Todd Martin, brought up this point that it's a good customer break point, for a lot of people to be like, well, I don't know, you're really changing, and I think it's a lot of friction for the customer. You're sort of changing the method at which people have to make the purchase and consume the content. So when you've already got an audience that maybe isn't as engaged or doesn't have a lot of goodwill with your product. It may be just that, an inconvenience enough to be like, well, maybe I won't, it's sort of a non-decision. You don't take the step to sign up for ESPN Plus or whatever it is, and then you sort of disengage or engage less with the product. So I think there's a lot of risk there for WWE if they change the way that they sell the pay-per-view. And at the same time, I think when you've got a company that's run by Vince McMahon, and particularly the creative is run by Vince McMahon, and I don't see any end in sight I don't see any way that the Raw or SmackDown content, main roster content, is going to get that much better while he's in creative control. He's not going to leave creative control. He's not going to hand it over to somebody else. So if that's the situation that you're in, I think, and this isn't certainly not the way they're calculating it, but if that's the situation that you're in, I think they look at it more as like, well, this is just the best we can do in terms of attracting an audience, the size of the audience. But if that's the situation that you're in, I think you're just in a better, you're better off to just try to get as much guaranteed money as you can, de-risk it, as they say, and rather than I think part of the idea of the network was to de-risk pay-per-view, and that so rather than selling a pay-per-view individually, where one month you do a lot of buys and another month you don't, you just get everybody to commit to a recurring $10 a month, and then they just sort of set it and forget it. But even this would sort of eliminate that consumer issue and just go go business to business, in that you just get somebody like ESPN to give you maybe $100 million a year for this, and then you don't have to worry about whether or not your pay-per-view is going to perform well and attract an audience. And I think that may not be a good idea economically in terms of motivation, in terms of creating the right kind of economic motivation that compels decision makers to create great shows. Because you sort of just even the talk when the network starts to launch is that, well, they're not going to try to put on good shows anymore because they know that they've got everybody's $10 and they're not going to try to pop a pay-per-view buy anymore. I think that would be even more exasperated when you don't even have to necessarily attract subscribers. You just have to provide content just like they do with Raw and SmackDown. So it's I don't know. That's kind of how I see it. It's kind of a bleak picture if you're somebody who wants WWE content to get better, but I think that's probably the situation they're going to end up in within a year or two.
Do you think it's a more effective strategy trying this version of the WWE Network, where we're going to try and cast a wider net to bring in free subscribers in the hope that we can convert a percentage of them, versus the tiered system where it's kind of coming to the realization we've got this number of people that will pay for this service. Let's try and get more money out of the existing subscriber base.
I guess doing the free version of the network where you don't even have to log in, I think that's how it works, right? You don't even have to log in. So that removes friction. So I don't even have to create a user account to try this thing out. And then maybe I sample it, and then maybe I like it. That seems like a smart strategy. As you said earlier, they've apparently decided not to do the premium tier. I don't know. Obviously, this service is way underpriced, and there's a lot of sort of problems with that. Like I said earlier, in terms of teaching the audience that an event is worth $10 at most. But I think there's at the least, they probably should be charging more for this, at least over time, if they're going to continue to put pay-per-views on there. But I don't know. We'll see. I think. But your question is just like, is the free tier a better idea than the trials?
Yeah.
I guess it's at least something different. I don't know if their conversion rates are going to be any better, but it's at least a way to attract more advertising revenue. So it's probably it's probably a better prospect than continuing on with the free trials.
I think the numbers are encouraging. I mean, granted, it's only been a month or 2 months, I guess we've seen of this at this point. But I think one of the biggest issues is trying to create new fans in any part of their business, because I think that's a really attractive part of AEW is that, yes, they have Dark, and they have, they're introducing the new women's tournament, but it's pretty much 2 hours. You can follow AEW for 2 hours a week. And for WWE, the jumping on point is the 3-hour flagship show on Monday nights, not to mention 2 on Friday. And if you want to be an NXT follower, it's an enormous commitment. I don't think they're creating a whole lot of new fans. It's just trying to maintain the existing fan base and just curb off erosion. So I look at the network that this is at least a part of their business where it seems that, yes, we could just double down on our existing subscribers and get more revenue out of them. This is an idea, hey, let's try and make this attractive to people that either dumped this service long ago or have never really sampled it. They were scared off by a $10 commitment.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, WWE has sort of entered into a situation where it's not necessarily great for creating new fans, but it's better than the alternative in terms of like having a 3-hour Raw is way more lucrative for them than having a 2-hour Raw, right? Mm-hmm. By probably 33%. Yep. But that creates a hurdle towards becoming a fan. But it gives them a lot more money. I think, on the other hand, I think it all comes down to the quality of the content. I think if you create stars and you create matches and, you create shows that people want to see, they'll come and see it, or maybe they won't watch all 3 hours of it, but they'll watch an hour or 2 or a few segments in greater volume than they are now.
Well, as we wrap up here, Brandon, this is also probably the shortened era has come to an end of the Frank Riddick transition period, because right. I would imagine that Christina Salem, their incoming CFO that starts on Monday, probably going to be the new voice of a lot of these quarterly earnings calls.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting. She's a former CFO for Etsy, and she has a lot of experience. She even has experience as being a stock analyst, a media analyst. She has some experience in consumer products as well, so she seems like a good fit. We'll see. I imagine we'll see her in all the roles that George Barrios was in terms of being the public face for investors, and we'll probably hear her at conferences, at the tech and media conferences that are webcast on corporate.w.com that everybody listens to along with me, I'm sure. But that'll be interesting. We'll see. I don't have a great idea of like what kind of CFO she'll be, or how she'll be different from Barrios. But
it's an empty bingo card, Brandon.
It is. People have been bringing up bingo to me. So we used to create a bingo card for George Barrios, who had a lot of interesting buzzwords, not just the kind of buzzwords that you're used to hearing on W television, but he had his own business speak and business buzzwords. So we'll see. But I do think Barrios used fewer buzzwords as time went on, and he became maybe more familiar with wrestling and the content. And hopefully it's not because he felt shame if the Barrios bingo card was passed around at Titan Tower. But no, I think it's really interesting. As far as I know, she's the first female CFO that W has ever had, and it seems like something that somebody like Stephanie McMahon is really excited about. So we'll see how it goes.
My final question. I was away this past weekend, and during my time away, I read Ron Hutchison's Pain, Torture, Agony book, and you were mentioned in this particular book, for working some Apocalypse Wrestling Federation shows in the late 2000s. And I was just curious if you have any memories of, I imagine these shows were in Whitby, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
Any memories of working for Ron? Because his shows were the very first independent shows I ever went to in early 2000 at this bar called Cactus Pete's. And I just was curious if you had any strong memories of the revamped AWF in the late 2000s.
Right. Well, I remember hearing, before I ever worked for Ron, I remember hearing stories about AWF. And because like Beth Phoenix had something to do with part of our early training for people who I started with. And I think she was the AWF champion, I think, at one point. Do you know about, were you there for that?
She was there. Like there was a period where like Gail Kim was working there consistently, Tracy Brooks, Beth Phoenix, like it became like a pretty, like a hotbed for, female wrestlers to come over. They brought Sumi Sakai over once, like all the way from Japan just to work like this small AWF show. So it kind of had its time just for, an outlet for female performers.
Yeah. So I heard some stories about it or whatever. I knew this was a promotion that I was aware of. And I think I was wrestling locally here, sort of in the Niagara Falls area on the New York side. And I think Ron Hutchison came to the show that I was on. And rarely, especially these days, do you get, a promoter like approaches you about a booking, especially at that, when you're sort of at the entry level. But, I don't remember if he talked to me after the show or what, but I ended up working for him. I think others, who I was close with in the Buffalo area who were wrestlers were working for him too. And, I only worked a couple shows for him, but, it was at like a comedy club, I think. And, I worked two shows for him. On the one I wrestled, Mastiff, Will Calrissian. And that was a good match, I think. I remember being told that we had to be careful about the projector that was up on the ceiling, that we could not climb to the top rope in that corner. But no, those were good shows. And Ron's always been a super nice guy to me. He's a really great promoter to deal with, and he's always, he's one of those people who's always like, every year or so, or year or two, you'll get a message from him being like, "Hey, just wanted to check in with you, see how you're doing." He's a super nice guy.
Yeah, I've really never met the guy, as much as we were both like here in the same city and I've gone to his shows and stuff, but he really underrated trainer. And I would definitely check out his book if you want to like grab it on Kindle or something. It's like a real fun read about a guy that did a lot of interesting things in his career, from, working undercard WWF shows at the Gardens here in Toronto. And
he works Black Saturdays. You know that?
I did not realize that he was there on the undercard, or on that very first show after Vince took over the time slots. That's a real interesting trivia question that he's attached to.
Yeah, so I think he's like putting over the Iron Sheik on Black Saturday, which is the first WWF show after they took over from Georgia, right?
Yes. Yeah. Well, Brandon, I want to thank you very much, as always, for joining us here. We could not put a bow on Q2 from the WWE without chatting with Brandon Thurston. And what is coming up from WrestleNomics? I know you already have a show up going very in depth into a lot of these subjects coming out of the earnings report and call, but the floor is yours, where our listeners can go follow the great Brandon Thurston.
You can follow me at Brandon Thurston. I also tweet from the WrestleNomics account at WrestleNomics. I write stuff on WrestleNomics.com, which I'm insane. It's ad free. There's no paywall. I don't know what I'm doing, but it's free and you can read it. And I think I'm the person in the world outside of Stamford, Connecticut, who looks at WSEC filings maybe more than anybody else. I've got a survey that I did, Pro Wrestling Favorability Survey. am gradually working on that. Should have something on that eventually. But yeah, every week, dropping every Saturday morning, there's a WrestleNomics podcast that is a result of me locking myself in a walk-in closet and talking to myself at various intervals for about 5 hours as I research stuff and all that. So yeah, that's you can follow me at Brandon Thurston. Go to WrestleNomics.com.
WrestleNomics.com, check out all of his great work. It's a vital resource for anyone looking to dissect the industry at a very minute detail, which Brandon does a fantastic job of also translating a lot of stuff for just basic understanding of the WWE's business. So thanks as always, Brandon. I hope we can do this again sometime soon as we enter into the Christina Salem era of WWE.
Yes, I can't wait. You guys have been doing a great job with Post Wrestling too. I've been listening.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, everyone, we'll be back later tonight. Wei Ting will return on Rewind to SmackDown, and we will speak with all of you later tonight.